Crossfire Zone. Chapter 1. Welcome to Carson. Jack Reacher arrived in Carson, a forgotten town deep in the New Mexico desert. The scorching sun reflected off the cracked asphalt, and the wind stirred up clouds of dust, blending them into the desolate landscape. Carson was the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps, perfect for someone looking to disappear or for things to happen unnoticed. Reacher stepped off the bus, his eyes scanning the town. One main street stretched ahead, lined with tired buildings that seemed to have long ago given up on a brighter future. Storefronts had faded signs, and few people walked the streets, most of them keeping their heads down. The kind of place where people minded their own business. Exactly the kind of place that attracted Reacher's curiosity. He walked into the town's diner, a rundown joint with worn-out furniture and a flickering neon sign hanging crooked above the entrance. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The air inside was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and fried food. Reacher made his way to the counter, taking a seat at one of the cracked vinyl stools. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with fiery red hair that had clearly been dyed, approached him with a weary smile. Her eyes studied him with the same curiosity that followed him wherever he went. "You don't look like you're from around here," she said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug and sliding it in front of him. Reacher took a sip. It was bitter, old, but it served its purpose. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice low, as usual. He wasn't one to share more than necessary. The waitress leaned on the counter. Not many pass through Carson these days. Most who do, don't stick around long. She straightened up, glancing out the window as if expecting someone to walk in. "Trouble's been brewing around here." Reacher didn't respond, but he filed the comment away. He was used to towns like this, quiet on the surface, but with something dark lurking beneath. The kind of place where law and order were weak, and chaos had a way of taking control. As he finished his coffee, two men walked into the diner. They were big, heavy-set, with leather jackets and tattoos visible on their necks. They barely glanced at Reacher but exchanged looks with the waitress, who suddenly seemed on edge. One of them muttered something to her under his breath, and she nodded nervously. Reacher noticed the shift in her demeanor immediately. She didn't meet his eyes as she hurried to the kitchen, and the two men sat at the far end of the counter, quietly eyeing him from a distance. They were trying to act casual, but Reacher knew trouble when he saw it. He stood up, paid for the coffee, and stepped outside. The heat hit him like a wall again, but this time, there was something more than just the oppressive sun. The air felt thick with tension. Whatever was going on in Carson, it was just beneath the surface, and Reacher had the distinct feeling that he had just walked into the middle of something big. Do you feel the tension building? Subscribe now to see what Reacher uncovers in this forgotten town. Chapter 2. A Storm Brewing. Reacher stepped out of the diner and onto the dusty street, the weight of the sun pressing down on his shoulders. Carson seemed like a town frozen in time, but the more he looked around, the clearer it became that something was off. The two men from the diner hadn't followed him outside, but he could feel their eyes on his back as if they were measuring him, trying to decide whether he was a threat. He started walking down the main street, taking in his surroundings. A few shops stood empty, their windows boarded up. A gas station at the end of the block looked abandoned, with rusted pumps and no attendant in sight. Carson wasn't just forgotten, it was decaying. At the far end of the street, Reacher noticed a black SUV parked outside a small building that looked like the town's only motel. Two more men leaned against the hood, both dressed similarly to the guys from the diner. Reacher's instincts kicked in. Whoever these men were, they weren't locals, and they weren't just passing through. They were waiting for something, or someone. Reacher continued walking, his pace unhurried. He had no destination in mind, but he liked to get a feel for places like this before deciding his next move. As he passed by the SUV, he caught a glimpse of one of the men watching him closely, muttering something to his companion. Reacher kept walking, but now he knew. Carson was more than just a forgotten town. It was a battleground. At the end of the street, a small, grimy bar stood with a flickering open sign hanging in the window. Reacher decided to step in, figuring it was the best place to gather more information. As he entered, the air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and old beer. A few patrons sat at the bar, nursing drinks and keeping to themselves. Reacher took a seat at the far end of the bar and signaled for a drink. The bartender, an older man with a face weathered by years of hard living, slid a beer across the counter without a word. Reacher nodded in thanks but stayed quiet. He was waiting. Minutes passed, and then the door creaked open. Reacher didn't turn around, but he heard the unmistakable sound of boots scraping across the wooden floor. Two men approached, and it didn't take long for Reacher to recognize them, the same two from the SUV outside. One of them spoke, his voice low and rough. "You don't belong here, stranger. Best you move on before things get complicated." Reacher didn't respond at first, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle them. He turned slightly in his seat, locking eyes with the man who spoke. "I'll move on when I'm ready." The man stiffened, clearly not used to being challenged. His companion stepped forward, a bit too eager, his hand twitching near his belt where a knife gleamed. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he growled. Reacher stood up, slowly, his frame towering over them both. He didn't make a move, but the shift in tension was immediate. The two men weren't expecting someone who didn't back down, and it threw them off balance. "I don't need to know," Reacher said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm betting you do." The two men hesitated, their eyes darting to each other. Reacher could see the indecision in their faces, and he knew they weren't ready to escalate things, yet. Without another word, they backed off, slowly retreating toward the door. As they left, the bartender gave Reacher a long, thoughtful look. "You've just stepped into a war, son," he said, wiping down the counter. "And it's about to get ugly." Reacher took another sip of his drink, unfazed. Wouldn't be the first time. Things are heating up in Carson. Want to know what's coming next? Subscribe to see Reacher in action as the tension explodes. Chapter 3. Enemies on both sides. Reacher left the bar with the bartender's words echoing in his mind. "You've just stepped into a war." The town of Carson, quiet and decaying on the surface, was clearly a battleground for something much darker underneath. He had no idea what the stakes were yet, but it was only a matter of time before he found out. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty street. Reacher took a moment to scan his surroundings, his sharp instincts already picking up subtle changes. The black SUV was gone, but a few figures were now moving about, slipping into alleys and doorways, watching him. They thought they were being discreet. They weren't. He walked slowly, his mind processing everything he'd seen so far. There were at least two factions in play, both with the same signature, tough guys with matching tattoos, too well organized for simple street thugs. They were sizing each other up, and Reacher had no interest in being caught in the middle. But he knew from experience that walking away wasn't always an option. As he passed the town's dilapidated motel, he noticed a shadow move behind one of the broken windows. A moment later, a man stepped out from the entrance, his face hidden in the twilight. Unlike the others, he wasn't trying to hide. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, waiting. "Reacher." The man called out, his voice cold and flat. Reacher stopped, his body tensing slightly. "Depends who's asking." The man stepped closer, revealing himself. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and had the look of someone used to giving orders. He didn't smile, didn't show any sign of friendliness. "I've heard about you. You've made a name for yourself." "Must have been someone else," Reacher replied, keeping his tone casual. But the man's presence set off alarms. This wasn't just another foot soldier, this was someone higher up in the chain, someone who didn't get their hands dirty unless it was important. "We don't want any trouble here," the man continued, ignoring Reacher's denial. But you're walking into something that's not your business. Best you turn around and head back where you came from. Reacher didn't flinch. I'll go where I need to go. The man's eyes narrowed. That's not an option. This town's under new management, and you're not welcome. We've got enough problems without an outsider making things worse. Reacher didn't move, didn't blink. He had been in this situation 100 times before. Someone trying to intimidate him, using vague threats to push him out of the way. But Reacher never backed down. Then it sounds like you've got a problem, Reacher said. But I'm not part of it. The man's expression darkened. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You are now. Before Reacher could respond, another voice interrupted. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding. Leave him alone, Vaughn. Reacher turned to see a woman approaching from the opposite side of the street. She was in her mid-30s, with short dark hair and a confident stride. She carried herself like someone used to authority, and the way Vaughn tensed at the sight of her told Reacher she wasn't just another bystander. This is between me and him, Vaughn growled, but the woman wasn't having it. No, it's between you and me, she snapped. And you know the rules. No moves without my say. Vaughn hesitated, clearly not liking the situation, but after a long pause, he took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine. But this isn't over. With that, he turned and disappeared into the growing darkness, leaving Reacher and the woman alone in the fading light. She looked him over, sizing him up. You're not part of this mess, but you're about to get dragged in. I hope you know what you're doing. Reacher shrugged. I usually figure it out. The woman nodded, as if she expected that answer. Name's Elena. I run things on this side of town. Vaughn runs the other. And right now, we're one bad decision away from all-out war. Reacher studied her for a moment. And you think I'm going to tip the balance? Elena smiled slightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. In this town, anyone who shows up is a player, whether they want to be or not. The stakes are rising. Who will Reacher side with in this dangerous game? Subscribe to find out who holds the upper hand. Chapter 4. Lines in the Sand. Reacher leaned against the wall of the motel, watching as Elena sized him up. The tension between her and Vaughn was thick, and it was clear that whatever was happening in Carson wasn't just a small-time dispute. It was bigger, and Reacher had a feeling it was about to boil over. Elena spoke first, breaking the silence. You probably don't care about what's going on here, but if you stick around, you'll have to choose a side. I don't do sides, Reacher said flatly. She crossed her arms, clearly not convinced. That might work in bigger towns, but Carson doesn't have room for neutrality. You're either with us or against us. Vaughn's crew is pushing hard, and if they take control, this place will fall apart completely. Reacher didn't say anything for a moment, weighing her words. He wasn't the type to get involved in local power struggles, but the way she talked, it sounded like Vaughn's men weren't just thugs. They were something worse, something more organized. That piqued his interest. What's Vaughn after? Reacher finally asked. Elena sighed, her face hardening. Control. He's moving product through here, drugs, weapons, you name it. Carson's remote enough that no one's watching too closely, and the authorities, well, they've either been bought off or scared off. Sounds like you've got a handle on things, Reacher said, his tone neutral. I do, she replied. But Vaughn's pushing harder than ever. He's brought in new people, muscle from outside. He's gearing up for something bigger, and I don't have enough firepower to stop him. Not without help. Reacher remained quiet, but Elena wasn't finished. You don't seem like someone who likes people like Vaughn running the show, she continued. You've probably taken down guys like him before. Maybe you could do it again. Reacher took a deep breath, scanning the darkening town. The streets were almost deserted now, the few people who remained hurrying to lock themselves inside their homes. The signs were all there. This town was on the brink of something bad. And even though Reacher had no stake in it, he had a gut feeling this wasn't the kind of situation he could just walk away from. Maybe, Reacher said, non-committal. Elena pressed her lips together, clearly wanting more. Look, I know you don't want to get involved, but if Vaughn takes over, there'll be nothing left of Carson worth saving. And trust me, he won't let you just walk away once things go south. Before Reacher could respond, the distant roar of an engine cut through the air. A black pickup truck sped down the street, kicking up dust in its wake. Reacher's eyes narrowed as it approached the motel. The truck screeched to a halt a few yards away, and 3 men jumped out, each armed and clearly ready for trouble. Elena tensed beside him. Vaughn's men. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto Reacher first, then flicked to Elena. Time's up, Elena. Vaughn wants an answer. Elena didn't flinch. Tell Vaughn he'll get one when I'm ready. The man's lip curled into a sneer. That's not how this works. You're either with us, or you're out. And we both know what happens if you're out. Reacher watched the exchange silently, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. The tension was palpable, and it wouldn't take much to spark violence. The 3 men were armed, but Reacher had dealt with worse odds before. The man with the scar took a step closer to Elena. So, what's it gonna be? Before Elena could respond, Reacher spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the air. How about you walk away while you still can? The 3 men shifted their attention to Reacher, sizing him up. The leader's eyes narrowed. This isn't your fight, stranger. Don't make it one. Reacher took a step forward, his gaze locking onto the man's. It is now. For a moment, the street went silent. The 3 men looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. They had numbers and weapons, but something about Reacher gave them pause. After a long, tense moment, the man with the scar spat on the ground. You just made a big mistake. He turned and motioned for his men to get back in the truck. As they climbed in, the leader pointed at Reacher. Vaughn's gonna hear about this. And he's not gonna be happy. With a roar, the truck sped off into the distance, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Elena exhaled slowly, the tension easing only slightly. You just put yourself on Vaughn's radar. Reacher shrugged. I've been on worse. Vaughn's men are gunning for Reacher now. Will he take the fight to them or face off on his own terms? Subscribe to see what happens next. Chapter 5. The first move. Reacher knew that things were about to escalate. Vaughn's men wouldn't wait long before making their move, and Reacher didn't like the idea of sitting around, waiting for them to come back with more firepower. He glanced at Elena, who was still trying to process what had just happened. You should get your people ready, Reacher said, his voice calm but firm. Elena's eyes narrowed. I don't have people, Reacher. Just a few folks who still care enough to stand up against Vaughn. But we're outnumbered and outgunned. That'll change soon, Reacher replied. Vaughn's going to push harder now that he knows I'm involved. Elena frowned, not quite understanding. Why would he care about you? You're just passing through. Maybe, Reacher said, turning his gaze toward the horizon where the truck had disappeared. But he doesn't know that. Guys like Vaughn, when they see someone standing up to them, they can't let it slide. Makes them look weak. So he'll come back with more men, more guns, and he won't be as polite next time. Elena shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. I don't have the resources for this kind of war. Reacher studied her for a moment. She was tough, no doubt about it, but she was in over her head. This wasn't just a small-town power struggle. Vaughn's operation sounded like the kind of organized crime Reacher had dealt with plenty of times before. He knew what was coming, and Carson was about to get caught in the middle. Tell me everything you know about Vaughn's operation, Reacher said, his tone decisive. And I mean everything. Elena hesitated. What are you planning to do? Reacher's eyes didn't waver. Figure out how to take him down. Elena exhaled slowly and began to speak. Vaughn came in about 2 years ago. At first, it was small, just a couple of guys pushing drugs through the town. But then it grew. He started smuggling weapons, hiring mercenaries from outside. Now, he controls most of the town, and those who don't work for him either keep their heads down or disappear. He's got connections, people in higher places, and that makes him dangerous. Reacher nodded, absorbing the information. Where does he operate from? He's got a base a few miles out of town. Old warehouse, used to be part of a mining company before they went bust. It's fortified, though. He's got lookouts, guards, the works. Reacher's mind raced, already forming a plan. Vaughn might have the numbers and firepower, but Reacher knew how to dismantle an operation like his, take out the leadership, disrupt their supply lines, and cause enough chaos to make them question their control. Vaughn's men would scatter once they realized he wasn't invincible. You said you don't have people, Reacher said, looking back at Elena. But you've got a few who still care, right? She nodded. Yeah, but they're not fighters. They're just tired of being pushed around. They don't have to be fighters, Reacher replied. They just need to know how to follow directions. I'll handle the rest. Elena gave him a long look, as if weighing her options. She knew what Reacher was suggesting was risky, borderline suicidal, but she also knew that Vaughn's grip on Carson was tightening every day. If something didn't change soon, the town would be lost for good. All right, she said, finally relenting. But if we do this, we need to be smart about it. Vaughn's men are everywhere. If they get wind of what we're planning, they'll hit us before we even get started. We'll move fast, Reacher said. Take the fight to them before they realize what's happening. Elena nodded. I'll round up the few I trust. Meet me at the old church on the edge of town in an hour. We'll go over the details. Reacher agreed with a simple nod and watched as she turned and walked away, her posture tense but determined. He turned his attention back to the street, scanning for any signs of Vaughn's men. There was none. For now, the town was still quiet, but Reacher knew that wouldn't last. He had less than an hour to come up with a plan, and once Vaughn realized Reacher was coming for him, the entire town would be caught in the crossfire. He made his way to a nearby alley, where he leaned against the wall, deep in thought. He didn't have the advantage of numbers or weapons, but that never stopped him before. He needed to be strategic, hit them fast, hit them hard, and leave no room for retaliation. The faint sound of an engine pulled him from his thoughts. Another black SUV rolled down the main street, slowing as it passed. Reacher didn't move, staying in the shadows as the vehicle coasted by. The windows were tinted, but he could feel the eyes inside scanning the area, searching for any signs of trouble. Vaughn's men were already moving, preparing for something bigger. Reacher's time was running out. The plan is in motion, and Vaughn's men are closing in. Will Reacher's strategy be enough? Subscribe to see the next explosive chapter. Chapter 6. The Attack. The old church on the edge of town was quiet, its once grand structure now reduced to crumbling stone and shattered stained glass. Reacher arrived early, scanning the perimeter with practiced eyes. It was a good spot, isolated, with only one road in and plenty of cover if things went wrong. He positioned himself near a broken window and waited for Elena and her group to arrive. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the desert. The air was heavy with tension, like the calm before a storm. Reacher knew the clock was ticking. Vaughn wasn't going to sit back and wait for him to make a move. But Reacher wasn't interested in waiting either. He was ready to take the fight to Vaughn. A few minutes later, Elena appeared with 3 others in tow. They looked nervous but determined. One was a middle-aged man with a weathered face, another a young guy barely out of his teens, and the third was a woman about Elena's age, her eyes sharp with focus. They weren't soldiers, but Reacher could tell they had fight in them. Elena approached, giving Reacher a nod. "This is what we've got. Not much, but we're all in." Reacher studied the group for a moment. "Good enough." He motioned for them to gather around, his voice low and commanding. "Here's the plan. Vaughn's got men spread out around town, but his main force is at the warehouse, about 5 miles out. They think they're untouchable there. That's our advantage. They're not expecting us to come to them." The young guy shifted uneasily. "But they've got guns, right? We don't have enough firepower to take them head-on." "We're not going in through the front door," Reacher said. "We'll hit them from the sides, disrupt their operation, and make them come to us. We use the terrain, hit and run. Create enough confusion, and Vaughn's men will start panicking. They're not as tough as they look when the plan falls apart." Elena's face hardened with determination. "And Vaughn?" "He's mine," Reacher said simply. They all exchanged looks. Reacher could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see that they were ready. This was their town, their lives on the line. And tonight, they were going to fight for it. "We move in 2 teams, Reacher continued. "Elena, you take the younger guy and circle around the back. Create as much noise as possible. The rest of us will hit from the side and draw their attention. Once they're distracted, we'll cut off their escape route." Elena nodded, already mentally preparing. The young guy looked pale but determined. The older man and woman listened carefully, following every detail of Reacher's plan. "Timing is everything," Reacher said. "We don't have the numbers or firepower to sustain a long fight. This needs to be quick and clean." The older man spoke for the first time, his voice gruff. "And if it goes south?" Reacher's eyes didn't waver. "It won't." The sound of distant engines broke the silence. Reacher's head snapped toward the road, his instincts sharp. He spotted 2 vehicles approaching fast, black SUVs, just like the one from earlier. Vaughn's men were already on their way. "We need to move," Reacher said, his voice a low growl. "Now." They scattered into position, moving quietly but with purpose. Reacher took his team to the side of the church, crouching behind a broken wall as the SUVs rolled closer. Elena and her team slipped around the back, vanishing into the growing shadows. The SUVs pulled to a stop just outside the church. The doors opened, and 6 men stepped out, each armed with rifles. They weren't looking for a conversation. They were here to finish what Vaughn had started. Reacher watched them from his position, calculating his next move. He waited until the men spread out, moving cautiously toward the church, their weapons raised. They didn't see him yet. He had the element of surprise. With a swift motion, Reacher darted out from behind the wall, taking down the first man with a brutal strike to the throat. The man crumpled to the ground before he could even cry out. Reacher grabbed the rifle from his hands and swung it around, knocking out the second man with the butt of the weapon. Gunfire erupted from the other side of the church as Elena's team made their move. The sound of bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, and Vaughn's men scrambled to respond, unsure of where the attack was coming from. Reacher didn't give them time to regroup. He moved through the chaos like a shadow, disarming one man and using his weapon to neutralize another. His movements were quick, efficient, every strike calculated to take out his target without wasting a second. In the midst of the fight, he spotted a figure emerging from one of the SUVs, Vaughn. He stood back, barking orders at his men, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Reacher's eyes locked on him. Vaughn was about to learn that tonight, control was no longer his. Reacher made his way through the remaining guards, his eyes fixed on his target. Vaughn turned just in time to see Reacher approaching, and for a brief moment, fear flickered across his face. "You should have stayed in the shadows," Reacher said coldly as he closed in. Vaughn reached for his gun, but Reacher was faster. In a blur of motion, Reacher disarmed him and threw him to the ground with a forceful shove. Vaughn gasped for air, trying to crawl away, but Reacher grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "It's over," Reacher growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Call off your men, or you won't walk out of here." Vaughn, his face pale and eyes wide with fear, knew he had no choice. The final showdown has begun. Will Reacher finish what he started? Subscribe to see how it all ends in the next chapter. Chapter 7. Endgame. Vaughn stumbled back as Reacher released him, his face pale, fear flooding his eyes. The gunfire around them was slowing, the chaos beginning to quiet as Vaughn's men realized they were losing control of the situation. One by one, they started retreating, their confidence shattered by the sudden and brutal ambush. Vaughn's voice cracked with panic as he tried to speak. All right, call it off." He reached for his radio, his hands trembling. "Pull back. Everybody pull back." The response came quickly. The men still standing stopped firing, retreating toward their vehicles. Reacher watched as they scrambled, some wounded, others abandoning their weapons as they fled. The tide had turned, and Vaughn's operation was crumbling right in front of him. But Reacher wasn't finished. He grabbed Vaughn by the collar again, dragging him away from the chaos. Vaughn struggled, but Reacher's grip was iron. He pulled him behind the church, away from prying eyes, where the silence of the desert swallowed them both. Vaughn's breath came in ragged gasps as Reacher shoved him against the wall. "You're done," Reacher said, his voice cold. "Carson doesn't belong to you anymore." Vaughn spat on the ground, his anger flaring despite the fear. "You think this changes anything? You're just one guy. My people." "They're gone," Reacher interrupted, cutting him off with an icy glare. "And by the time they regroup, you'll be long out of the picture." Vaughn sneered. "You're just passing through. This town will go back to the way it was the moment you leave. I've got friends in high places." Reacher stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Not anymore." Vaughn tried to speak again, but Reacher didn't give him the chance. In one swift motion, he slammed Vaughn's head against the wall, just enough to knock him out cold. Vaughn's body slumped to the ground, unconscious. Reacher stood over him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could have ended Vaughn's life right there, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he dragged Vaughn to the front of the church, tossing him like discarded trash in front of the remaining survivors. Elena and her team emerged from the shadows, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. The fight was over. Vaughn's men were gone, and the Mun himself lay crumpled on the ground. Elena approached cautiously, looking at Vaughn's unconscious form and then at Reacher. "Is it over?" "For now," Reacher said, his voice calm but still holding that edge. "His men are scattered. It'll take time for him to regroup, if he ever does." The older man, the one who had fought alongside Reacher, stepped forward. "And what about the town? Vaughn's been running things here for years. People are scared." Reacher glanced at the man, then at Elena. "That's up to you now." Elena met his gaze, her face set with determination. "We'll take care of it. This town's been under Vaughn's thumb for too long. It's time we take it back." Reacher nodded, satisfied with her answer. Carson was no longer his problem, but he had set things in motion. The people here had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim their lives. He turned and started walking down the dusty road, leaving the church, the chaos, and Vaughn behind. Elena called after him, her voice hesitant. "Where will you go now?" Reacher didn't look back. "Wherever the next bus takes me." The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.